Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is hopefully October 9th, 2017, and I'm your host, Cara Santa Maria. Now, the reason I say it's hopefully October 9th is if you were listening last week, you would know that I am out of the country right now. I'm in North Africa, where I have very little service. Hopefully, I will have been able to upload this episode on time, but I'm pre-recording the intro back at home with all of my equipment so I don't have to lug it halfway across the world. That said, I guess we will see when we see. We have a great episode this week, and I want to thank all of you who made Talk Nerdy possible by rating and reviewing in iTunes, in other podcast services, by shopping in the Talk Nerdy store. I promise I will get your shipments out to you as soon as I get home. And by supporting the show via carasantamaria.com, where you can find the Talk Nerdy store and also the PayPal portal, and via patreon.com/talknerdy. I'll give you guys individual shout outs when I'm back. I haven't been able to check because I'm time traveling and recording this early. So let's jump right into this week's episode. I had a wonderful, wonderful chat with Tristan Gooley. He's the author of the brand new book, How to Read Nature, Awaken Your Senses to the Outdoors You've Never Noticed. Now, he's a naturalist in the truest sense. He spends time outdoors. He keeps his senses open, his eyes, his ears, his nose, his mouth, his touch sensations. And he uses all of that to start to develop really a sixth sense about what nature is trying to tell him. And I know that sounds wooey, but it's actually quite scientific. And we're going to discuss that throughout the show. We really talk about that lost art of natural navigation and a lot of tips and tricks that we can utilize that we've sort of forgotten over the course of relying heavily on technology and sort of separating ourselves from nature. So this one was especially exciting for me to prep for my trip. So I hope you don't mind me being a little indulgent in asking specific questions about heading to North Africa. But gosh, such a fun chat, such a great book. So without any further ado, here he is, Tristan Gooley. Well, Tristan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me on, Cara.
I'm really excited because you're a multi-talented author in that you don't just do reporting and writing, but you have true expertise in the field that you write about. And I don't think that we've done much on my show kind of down and dirty naturalism yet. And so I think that this is going to be a really fun deep dive into kind of news you can use, tips and tricks for everyday people who really do fancy themselves naturalists to get out there and to connect with Mother Nature in a way that maybe they don't feel comfortable doing right now. That's really what you focus on, isn't it?
Yeah, my work is different from most naturalists in the sense that there's a lot of great work going on out there, which is talking about how wonderful everything is and how beautiful everything is and how we need to do more immersing ourselves and connecting with nature. And I'm all for that. I'm totally supportive of that movement. But the thing that makes my work a bit different is it's about things you can actually look for, and it's using the part of our brain which hasn't been used outdoors for quite a while, which is deductive, thinking. It's solving puzzles, using clues, seeing signs. It's all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. And so before we even get into some of the nitty-gritty of it, I'd love to know, how you first became enamored with the natural world and really where you started to hone all of those skills.
Well, I've got to be honest. I was what some people call a poacher-turned gamekeeper, in the sense that I loved adventures from a very young age. I'd see a hill and think might be more interesting at the top than the bottom, and I'd stand across a lake and think, I wonder what's on the other side. And the hills became mountains and the lakes became oceans. And if I'm honest, early on, nature was the green stuff that got in my way. I was like thinking, I want to be up there, and there's all this undergrowth getting in my way. Get out of my way. I've got a mission here. And then what happened was I developed conventional navigation skills, and I'd set myself goals, and I'd think, right, I want to do this year. And so I was learning how to get small boats and small planes and walking, and the journeys were getting bigger and bolder and that sort of stuff. And then what happened was, in about my mid-20s, I was taking on some quite ambitious stuff. And I suddenly noticed that it didn't feel as exciting as it had done when I was a kid. And so I was a bit distraught. Yeah, I was just a bit upset about that. I was like, wow, I'm doing some crazy thing. It's 1,000 miles start to finish. It's going to take me 10 days. It's going to be dangerous. It's going to be exciting. And yet it felt a bit flat. And then by chance, I came across the idea of finding my way using nature, natural navigation. And so I just tried it out, and I just did 1 mile across some local woods using the trees as my map and the stars as my compass. And suddenly the excitement was back. So that was the sort of the big turning point.
Yeah, I love that. It really is going back to our roots. I mean, we have so much technology, we have so many devices that, in many ways, do keep us alive. But then we think back to the idea that people lived for a long time before electricity, and when a terrible disaster strikes, like's been happening a lot over here in North America, between the hurricanes and the earthquakes that we've seen, and people are left without power for weeks, maybe months on end, there's a real concern that most people are going to suffer deeply and potentially even die.
Yeah, it's interesting, and we're hearing and seeing on the news, the devastation of the elements on your side of the Atlantic, and our sort of feelings of with the communities affected, and it's interesting from the perspective of this broader area, because I think there are two parallel but different shifts in philosophy towards the outdoors going on. One of them is the necessity side. So when there are, emergencies and there are disasters, it reminds people that things don't always go as well as we'd like them to.
Yeah.
And so and there's a sort of niche community. I don't know if you've come across them, called preppers, who kind of, they assume that it's all going to go, badly.
Absolutely, yeah. We have whole TV shows dedicated to doomsday preppers over here.
Yeah, I think we got it from you, and like a lot of stuff, it flows that way. But if I'm honest, my work is actually trying to step a little bit away from that, because whilst things like natural navigation and other outdoor fundamental skills can be used in those situations, hopefully they're not going to impact most of us. Whereas everybody spends a bit of time outdoors, even if it's 10 minutes in the park, on a busy work day or something. And actually, my work is much more about saying, instead of seeing that as a time when your brain is meant to totally shut down, there are a lot of people, not necessarily everyone, but a lot of people who relax by letting their brain play a bit. So if you think of people who do crosswords or Sudoku, all that sort of stuff, you're relaxing by letting your brain go at a nice kind of puzzle-solving speed. And my work's more about sort of saying, well, instead of sort of staring into the sky, thinking, right, that's it, the brain's doesn't need to work in this environment anymore, we can say, why don't we just ask the question, which way am I looking? And you suddenly find there are quite literally 1,000 clues, within a stone's throw, and it's just good fun.
Absolutely, and you don't have to live, on the edge of a forest or a large lake in order to truly experience kind of what nature has to offer, do you? You can even find these things in a city.
Absolutely, the philosophy applies absolutely anywhere that you can see a little bit of the outdoors. So if you stare out of an office window and ask yourself that same question, which way am I looking? There'll be clues in the sun. There'll be clues in the way the clouds are moving. There'll be clues in the way people are moving, because we're just animals with funny plumage. We dress ourselves up and try and kid ourselves. We're not. But if you just if you just take a nice simple urban example, well, if we take it back to our roots a little bit, people were able to explore planet Earth partly by observing animal behavior. So we now know that many of the Pacific islands were colonized almost certainly by leaning on bird behavior. So if you can imagine being on an island, you see one bird flying in a certain direction, you don't read too much into it. But if after 10 years you notice thousands of birds fly in one direction and then 6 months later they fly back in the opposite direction, it doesn't take our ancestors long to click there's something out there. And if we take that logic and that approach into the city, if you are totally lost in a big city and you're just trying to get some handle on where one big landmark is, if you walk against the flow of people in the morning or with the flow of people late in the afternoon, you'll find a station or transport hub, and so you've made a map out of the way people are walking.
Absolutely. Yeah. It reminds me a little, do you remember those videos? I want to say they came out in the 80s, the Koyaanisqatsi movies, and no, you don't know what I'm
No,
talking about,
no,
do you?
no. I'd love to say yes. I have no idea, but I must seek them out. They sound like something I might enjoy.
Oh, they were just beautiful. They were these experimental films that came out in 1982, and it was a lot of kind of time lapse photography, was set to um, a beautiful score. There was, I think, Koyaanisqatsi is the one that a lot of people remember. Yeah, it was composed by Philip Glass. Koyaanisqatsi, Life Out of Balance, and it was slow motion and time lapse of cities and landscapes, and it showed like movement and things. And there was a series, I think, of 3 of these different films. Oh yeah, Powaniskatsi and Nakoikatsi, I think, which I'm assuming are like Native American terms. But it really gave you that sense that there are natural patterns, that they're like we are little ants marching around, building our own maps and having our own intrinsic navigation, even if we're not necessarily physically reading a paper map or using a GPS.
Oh, I love that. And I was about to say it's probably something I've seen, but maybe didn't know the name of. But when you're describing it, I love the sound of it, and I'm not sure I have seen it, so I'll have to search that out.
Oh, I absolutely recommend it. It's really great. So, I just want to point to the fact, because I would be remiss if I didn't, that you have a new book. It's coming out October 3rd. So by the time this podcast airs, and I think when this podcast airs, just so that everybody knows, at this point they will have known already, I will be in the Sahara, and so we will see exactly. I'm hoping that this will actually go live on. October 9th as planned, but depending on connectivity issues, because I will be in Morocco, I will probably have some Wi-Fi when I'm in certain hotels, but if I'm out in the desert, I know we'll be camping 1 or 2 nights. We may not be very connected. So that's just a little, that said, you do have a book coming out on October 3rd called How to Read Nature, Awaken Your Senses to the Outdoors You've Never Noticed. So in this book, are you really, and this is just one of many in kind of a series of these personal naturalist books that you've written, and we'll touch on a few of them in a moment. But is this book mostly focused on just ways to open your eyes, your ears, your nose, your tongue to all of the things that nature has to offer you?
Yeah, it's in a sense it's a slightly sneaky book, and what I'm trying to do is trick people into enjoying nature by getting past all of the obstacles that it's that poacher turned gamekeeper thing again. Because if somebody had said to me 25 years ago, find nature interesting, I would have resisted it automatically. I was like, don't tell me what to find interesting, whereas and I think we're all like that, and it's fair enough. And so this book is sort of it's using all of the fascinating ways into nature that I've learned that so. Just let me give you one example. One of the exercises that's in it. If you go for a really short walk, I mean really short, like 3 minutes, and just write down at the end of it a few of the things that you noticed, then do exactly the same walk again, but this time you've got to force yourself not to look at things that are showing any motion at all. So you're not allowed to look at a flickering leaf. You're not allowed to look at a person walking or a car moving or a cloud moving or anything like that. And then note down the things that you see. And it's just the start of sort of effectively looking at our senses, our hardware, and our brain, our software in a slightly different way, because our senses feed so much information to our brain that our brain has evolved to filter out almost all of it. So this is one of those exercises that kind of overrides that and says, no, wait a minute, I'm going to choose what I focus on. Let's not filter everything out here. And because motion was an indication of something that could be a threat or an opportunity in historical evolutionary terms, if we say, right, we're not going to look at that, we start to notice things that we could go our whole lives without seeing. So you start to see things that were right in front of you and have been for years, but your brain has not allowed you to look at. So it's just one example of how we can kind of trick ourselves to have a slightly more interesting experience.
Oh, I love that. And it really does build upon a theme that I think we talk about a lot on this podcast, which is that we sort of evolved to experience our world the way that it has been. I mean, not necessarily presented to us. I think we tend to speak in these very like anthropocentric terms, but the way that our world has been relevant to us, right? So, historically, we were looking out for threats, we were looking out for sources of pleasure, of pain, of poison, and it really kind of extends to the very reason that we're not good at risk analysis, the very reason that very, very large things and very, very small things are quite difficult for us to comprehend. Things that are microscopic or even smaller, atomic, very large distances, when we talk about astrophysics, are quite difficult for us to understand because they sort of don't exist in the evolutionary plane that we've been experiencing our whole lives. And I think that this comment that you made really piggybacks that when you just go outside and you just open your eyes, your ears, your nose, whatever senses you have available to you personally, we have this problem of accommodation. You know, it's the same reason we can't feel our shoes all day. Because if we could
Yeah,
feel our shoes all day, it would not be very comfortable.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so if we can de-accommodate ourselves by just focusing our attention, we'll see and hear and smell and taste things and feel things that we didn't even realize were there.
Absolutely, and I'm working with that, and occasionally trying to rattle the cage a little bit by getting us to come at things in an entirely different angle. So another example would be that if again, if anyone had said to me many years ago, connecting with nature is wonderful, I'd sort of try and be polite and smile and think, what a vacuous thing to say. But if whatever our interests are, we are human beings. That's the only thing that we could say for certainty at this point in terms of connecting with nature. But as human beings, we couldn't exist. Our psychological makeup dictates that we must be interested in certain fundamental things because there are certain things that have kept us alive in the past and actually still linger and are part of our view of the world today. So an example would be shelter. Tens of thousands of years ago, if we couldn't make a shelter, we'd be dead within hours, possibly. And now it's easy to think, well, what's the relevance of that? We can go through our whole lives and not build a shelter, but we still live in homes. And so part of our makeup is an interest in what makes the home we want. So our ancestors might have been thinking, okay, we're not going to sleep under a beech tree because we know beech branches fall and kill people. That's the ancient view. But the modern view might be something like, I want a cool, clean, light look, so I'm going to use pine wood. Or I want a deep, rich, complex look, so I'm going to use cherry wood. And actually, those two things are the same part of the brain. It's the same part of our sort of, our ancestral psychological DNA. I don't even know the right expression at this moment, but I think you know what I mean.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and people who aren't interested in the home might be interested in travel or adventure, anything like that. And natural navigation is the way back. Or if you're interested in food, foraging is the way. So if you go up to somebody and say, try foraging, it's fun, some people will be receptive to that, and they're the people who own a lot of cookbooks. But a lot of people aren't. And my book is saying, if you're not interested in that, that's quite normal, and that's the majority of people. But everybody has an interest. They just don't perhaps realize that it extends from nature. So my book's about trying to find the route back to that original sort of interest.
It's so neat, and it's true because we do use terms that actually harken back to that. We talk about people nesting when they're getting ready to have a child and having this new interest
Yeah.
in like making sure the nursery is exactly like so. And that's what we did historically with, sticks and leaves and shit.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we think we're sophisticated and particularly in the age of technology, really forcing a bigger way into our lives. But actually, food goes in one end, it comes out the other, where we reproduce. We're animals.
Oh, yeah. Oh, definitely. We are so animals. And, I think all of us have, and not all of us, but many of us have experienced sort of the hard truth of nature when we've left home and gone someplace quite far away and, to an alien landscape or a place where we don't speak the language. And maybe there's much more quote unquote nature where we're headed than we're used to back home if we live in the city. But the truth of the matter is, we can experience this even if it feels quite normal to us, even if it feels quite in our backyard. And I love that you offer those kinds of tips and tricks in your new book. All of your books, though, and you have several. I'm seeing here you've got The Lost Art of Reading Nature Signs, which I think we'll touch on quite a bit, How to Read Water. You've got The Natural Navigator, and of course, The Natural Navigator has all sorts of sort of like spin-offy, like you've got like a pocket guide and a bunch of different editions of it online, I'm noticing.
Yeah, yeah. It was The Natural Navigator that changed my life, because I was teaching these skills. Well, to start with, I collected them. I was sort of going from ancient sources one day, reading about how Odysseus found his way across the Mediterranean by keeping the Arctos, the bear constellation, on his left. That's how he kept going east. And then the next minute, I'm reading something in a science journal that's been published 24 hours before, and I'm just collecting all of the stuff. And that's why I love the name of your show, your podcast, because I get accused of being nerdy the whole time, and
Oh, yeah.
I wear it as a badge. I wear with pride, because I collected all this stuff, and like anybody who's ready to admit they're a bit nerdy, that you have a moment where you think, maybe I'm the only person in the world who finds this interesting, and maybe I just keep it under this little bush here. And what I did is I just set up a course to teach it, and I was just ready for the world to tell me, in the way it can do, that it had no interest in my interest, and I just needed to get real and get on with things that everybody else found interesting. And that was 10 years ago, and I haven't stopped since. And so I was teaching this stuff to people, and then a publisher very kindly sort of dropped me a line and said, there might be more than a few dozen people interested in this. And so I wrote the book with this collection. I'm just so grateful. It's been really popular in the States, in the UK, and in many other countries.
I love that. So you legit have a natural navigation school?
Yeah, it's as small as a school gets, because I like being sort of footloose. So I could, in theory, have started employing people and taking on buildings and stuff. But it's just me, and where there's an interest, I go and teach. Although, being honest, these days, as a result of the success of the books, I've become more of a writer and communicator. And it sounds ridiculously sort of overblown, but I'm the champion. I'm almost like, I feel like the ambassador for this weird subject, because I just think it's so much. It's such a enjoyable way of learning stuff that adds a layer to our lives. And so, aside from it being the job, it's the passion, and I jump up and down and make a lot of noise about it, basically.
It's so great. Looking at your website, you have this great site nav on the side. Like, you have a site nav at the top so people can learn about you and see your talks and buy your books and all the great things that are usually on somebody's website. But you have this great site nav on the side that says, be guided by nature: sun, moon, stars, sea, plants, animals, weather, city, extreme, extraordinary, and water. It's so great that you've really been able to dig deep into all these different navigational tools. And really, it's partially about how to find your way out of a forest, or how to, get back to where you started from. But it's also partially about how to experience the breadth and the depth of the nature that's surrounding you, isn't it?
Yeah, that's spot on, because I think I think I've discovered I'm not the only person in the world who doesn't want to approach nature in a sort of airy philosophical way. But I've discovered, through a practical interest, through nuts and bolts, actually my philosophy and experience have changed dramatically. So a good example would be, once somebody knows how to find north using the stars, or a tree, or flowers, or insects, it starts as a kind of, okay, I find that quite interesting as a practical exercise. Let's see if it works. They go and do it a couple of times, and then it starts to work. And then they'll do something which I did many years ago, which is not a smartphone when I did it, but these days people probably use the compass on their smartphone or a traditional compass, and they go, oh yeah, that method for finding the North Star works because that star is actually north because this piece of equipment is telling me it is.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, and the next step, which is the kind of accidental philosophical change, which is when you suddenly realize that the star is not just a little bit more reliable than the kit, but infinitely more reliable. Because if the North Star isn't north, there are an awful lot of other things, going wrong in the universe that we need to worry about than our smartphone not working. So that's what happened to me. Is I check that the North Star was north because the compass told me that it was north. And then about 6 months later, I realized that when the needle didn't point at the North Star, I realized the compass was bust, the sky wasn't. And that you suddenly go, oh, wow, the universe works even when our kit doesn't. I love that.
And it makes me think that probably throughout this entire experience, and I've got to admit, I'm sort of one of those people that you described at the beginning who's like only just now becoming more interested in nature. I'm quite interested in sort of urban nature and urban wildlife, living in Los Angeles with a park right behind me. I live right on the kind of footsteps of Griffith Park, where we have quite a lot of diverse plants and animals, but I'm also in the middle of a very big city. And I'm one of those people who, super outdoorsy people who like wear Birkenstocks and are like, dude, yeah, we're going to camp every weekend. I'm like rolling my eyes. But at the same time, I'm becoming much more interested in it. And I would have to assume, and this has not happened to me yet, and hopefully it does, especially after reading all of your books, that there's another change that takes place, which is you start to get an intuition that's guided by all of the knowledge that you've gleaned, where you just start to feel north, or you just start to feel the right way out, or you start to be able to be guided by your instincts because those instincts are coming back into the forefront of your mind when they've been suppressed for so long.
This is really spooky because that's where a lot of my work has taken me. It for me, it started with quite big nuts and bolts and clunky sort of techniques, kind of like, okay, there's more tree on the south side, okay, yeah, I can see that. And then what happened was, a few years ago, I was driving along a road, 30 miles an hour. My mind was sort of on a meeting or something like that, and I wasn't thinking about nature at all. And just suddenly I sensed south. And out of the corner of my eye, I'd picked up what I call the check shape, because branches on the north side of a tree grow closer to vertical and branches on the south side grow closer to horizontal because phototropism, tropism growth, photolight, the way all plants grow towards the light just gives nature these shapes. And so that was kind of the science and the kind of I looked at this pattern, this shape so many times that my brain, some people call it the difference between slow thinking and fast thinking, or system one or system two, but none of that's terribly important. The interesting thing is, once we get used to looking for certain things and we practice it, our brain has evolved to take the shortcut. So that's exactly what happened. As I was just driving along and I sensed south and a tree out of the corner of my eye that I wasn't even looking at properly. And that's exactly as you're saying. It was, and I'm convinced, prior to the industrial and revolution and prior to the agricultural revolution, that's how our ancestors all sensed the world. They didn't walk out of a morning and go, I'm going to look for some interesting clues in the way the grass has been bent by the wind. They just sensed direction, even if the labels didn't pop into their head. They weren't thinking, oh, this grass is telling me that southeast is that way. They just sensed direction, if that makes sense.
Oh, for sure, because it was a pre-scientific era, so nobody had actually taken the time to, or at least we don't know if they had, we don't have good records to show, to fully document and systematically make those recordings, but people just knew. They just knew these things because they experienced it all the time. And like you said, our brains are so freaking good at schemas. That's what they do. Our brains figure out the shortcut and they can go there, and it's completely done subconsciously. We don't even realize that we're doing it, but we have that sense. You know how you just have a sense when you're going home as opposed to when you're going someplace new? It feels familiar and it feels comfortable. I'm headed home now. It's probably the same thing for the compass. It's probably the same thing for a lot of these different navigational experiences. Novelty requires more focused attention, right? Because we're someplace we've never been before. We need to be on the alert.
Absolutely. Yeah. This is really exciting stuff. I love this because novelty, as you're saying there, it's shorthand for our unconscious brain having recognized the pattern and spotted something that doesn't fit into it, and then pushing that back to the conscious and asking it the question, why doesn't this fit? It might be important. And then we look at it. And if I give you a couple of examples of, an ancient and then a more contemporary, experience of the same thing. If I'm in the woods, sometimes I can tell if a deer is looking at me, even though it's behind me, which starts to sound a bit like, oh, that's totally weird. But if I then explain, it does sound a bit kind of, is that far fetched? Is this guy claiming to have a sixth sense? Because I'm shooting out at this point because that's all nonsense, But actually, if I explain the kind of steps of how our ancestors and how occasionally I'm trying to emulate that in a more contemporary context. Imagine you're sitting in a cafe in a city with your back to the window, and one of the a waiter comes along and pours your coffee, and as they're doing it, you just get the sense that somebody outside is looking at you. And then you go home and you don't think much more of it. And a few hours later, your friend calls and says, "Oh, I was driving by really slowly and I saw you in that cafe and I was trying to get your attention, but because of the traffic, I had to keep moving." And you start piecing it together. Oh, so they were in the car, and the waiter was pouring the coffee. Noticed somebody gesticulating. I noticed the waiter pausing when they're pouring the coffee, and through the body language, my brain told me there's something going on behind. Somebody's probably looking at me. And so you suddenly realize that's not rocket science. This is all doable. Mm-hmm. And it's exactly the same. It's exactly the same in the wild. It's just getting used to different signs, noticing that the bird sounds change, and the direction of the wind and all of the patterns around you are telling you that something's changed behind you. And the most likely thing is, your brain suggests the most likely thing to fill the pattern. And in that instance, it might be a deer. And it's exciting.
Absolutely. And I think that there are a lot of people who have a really good development of that use it in the modern world. People like poker players, for example, or if you've ever, obviously we think of it as bullshit and woo, but there are people who are very good cold readers, people who are like psychics who are quite good at it. And it's not because they actually are psychic, and it's not because they actually have a special power. It's because they're so good at reading these micro expressions that people give them, and they can tell when they're on a good track or a bad track, and they know when to change course and things like that because they're just really dialed into that. And the truth is, we absolutely needed that historically. I mean, we are so used to being out of nature, right? We're so used to being in this sort of bubble of civilization that if we went out into the wild, we would probably be the last ones to know that there was a lion tailing us. Like all the other animals would have cleared out, right? We would have heard their calls, they would have rustled in the bushes, and we would have never even noticed those kinds of things unless we spent the time to open our eyes and to not so much develop that intrinsic kind of experiential instinct, but to bring it back to the surface.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me give you a fun sort of psychic, in inverted commas, example of that in practice. When I walk into the local woods, which I'm sat at the edge of now, I can tell when I see a bird and I walk towards it, I can tell whether the bird is a resident and I'm in its patch, or whether it's a visitor. And the behaviors are very easy to look for and very easy to recognize. A bird will flee more easily if it's trespassing, and it won't come back. Whereas a lot of the songbirds here, they're very territorial, and what they'll do is they'll hop away, but then ever shorter distances. And if you keep pushing them, they fly over you back to the center of their patch. So just by noticing how far they fly away and whether there's a sort of elasticity there, you can just sense intuitively, oh, okay, I'm in your patch. Yeah, sorry, But the same stuff you can do, in a much more contemporary context. If you're in a city just watching people, you can tell whether they're visitors or locals. And a lot of people listening are going, yeah, well, that's easy. You can spot a tourist a mile off. They're dressed ridiculously, and they, and all this sort of stuff. But okay, let's imagine we dress everybody the same. You can still spot the visitor because they just do little things like they will take longer to cross a road, and the fun stuff in terms of intuition in this area, I think, is that sometimes we can reach the answer without being able to explain how we got there. So if we watched a dozen people in a city, and then we had to fill in a form and say, tell me the 6 locals and the 6 visitors, we might get it spot on. And if then somebody said, how did you do that? You're psychic, that's magic, and we can't explain it. But our brain has spotted the pattern without bothering our conscious minds with the explanation.
Oh, it's so true. I'm going back to school. This is my first semester back. I've been out of school for about 10 years, but I'm starting the PhD over again. And this time I'm going in straight clinical psychology. And I'm always fascinated by all the studies that I get to read and the things I get to partake in when I'm studying psychology and neuroscience. For that very reason, there's so many amazing published studies where individuals have these instincts, these insights, these understandings without ever being able to verbalize why. That they'll have this quick processing where their finger, they're meant to click on a button and choose column A or column B, and they do it so quickly. And then when you ask them why they did it, they're like, I don't know, I was just supposed to. But it's
Yeah.
linked to something much deeper, and oftentimes it actually reflects reality.
Yeah, so you're going to do from the sounds of it, your second PhD in the Sahara. I'm just joining a few things you
Right?
said together
Yeah,
there.
exactly. No,
Yeah.
I'm so excited. I'm nervous because I'm going to fall behind on my schoolwork. I know it, but I get to leave, and we're recording this, just so you guys know, on September 29th. So only like about 2 weeks in advance, but I get to leave, actually this weekend for a couple of film shoots for a new TV show. I don't think I'm allowed to announce it yet, but soon I'll be able to. And I'm going to the East Coast of the United States, and then I'm going to Paris because I'm very lucky and I love Paris. And then I'm actually going to Morocco, and we're going to spend some time out in the Sahara Desert and spend some time with some Bedouins there. And I'm just thrilled because it's a part of the world I've never been to Africa. I had to get all these new vaccines. I'm being overly cautious in my preparations. I bought a water sterilizer pen, and I have, all of the things that I think that I need. But I would love to know from you. I'm totally co-opting this conversation. Is there anything you think I should keep my eyes out for? Are there any tips or tricks going into a very new landscape with, what I think of as like some harsh things that I'm not going to be used to really
Yeah.
experience it in a way that that I'll have the best opportunities?
Oh yeah, there's so much fun stuff to look for, and I share your apprehension, because I had exactly that same feeling when I travelled to Manhattan a few months ago. Um, and it turns out it's a safe and lovely place, but that's I'm slightly more comfortable in the wilder places. But yeah, to answer your question, in places like the Sahara. It's in terms of my love of natural navigation. A great thing you can start doing is making a map and compass out of everything you see, because that will actually make you more sensitive to anything that you might need in a more serious sense. So if we think about a map, water is obviously the scarce resource, and so a few drops of water will completely change the landscape. And you are bound to be spending some time, near or between oases or wadis or other places where there's water. And there are some really good ways of getting into the idea of using nature as a map by noticing how radically and how quickly things change with water. So, you don't need giant palm trees sticking out of the ground to sort of work out there's some water there. There are subtler things going on. And when I walked with some Tuareg across the Libyan Sahara some years ago, I used to ask them, because it was knackering. We're sometimes walking 20 miles in a day, and you're quite keen at the end of it for your cup of ridiculously strong green tea. So I'd say to them, I was a bit like a kid, are we nearly there yet? And in the end, it turned out that culturally, they'd always say nearly there, only their equivalent of saying like it's just around the corner, because they didn't want to upset me. They didn't realize that being told that and then walking for another 4 or 5 hours is quite upsetting. But anyway, the actual interesting thing happened was I had to solve the problem for myself, which was I noticed that the number of flies were telling me how long until we stopped. So if you're half a day's walk from an oasis, you won't see any flies really. Once you get within a couple of hours walk, you start to notice the odd one, and when it's only half an hour away, you will see flies all over the back of the person in front of you, and that's true of all the animals. Another fun little tip is desert landscapes appear totally homogeneous to our eyes until we get used to them. In the same way that if you took a Tuareg or a Bedouin into, a city centre, their brain's not used to those patterns, so it all looks sort of similar and sort of difficult. To them, everything looks different. And one of the ways you can kind of get used to that difference is with a tiny bit of height. So if you look at a landscape and it all looks totally similar, if you can find any way of going up, even 5 feet, 10 feet, climbing onto a camel, you suddenly notice, literally twice as much as you were seeing before. So it's one of those little desert tricks that you can be standing there thinking, I can't really see what's going on. And you just climb, 12 feet up a small dune and suddenly you can tell exactly what's going on.
Oh, that's so great. And I think we are planning on riding quite a few camels while we're out there. So I can't wait to see the difference between being down on the ground and being up with just a little bit of height. And I'm only 5'3", so a camel is going to give me quite a lot more height than I'm used to.
You may turn out to be the first person in history who enjoys riding camels.
Man, everything's exciting when it's new, isn't it?
It is, and you'll absolutely love the first 10 minutes. But I don't want to squash your dreams. But riding camels, I tried it for 20 minutes. I ended up walking for the next 10 days instead.
That is hilarious. Oh man. Well, luckily we just have to do it for the cameras. We'll see. I bet you we'll have a nice off-road vehicle waiting right behind.
Fingers crossed.
Right.
Fingers crossed. You'll be aware you can use the stars to find direction, and there are sort of diagrams in my books of how to do that. But a desert-specific thing is all sand dunes are effectively compasses, because anywhere on Earth, if you've tuned into the prevailing wind direction, so where the wind is coming from most often, everything is sculpted by that. So it can be the tops of trees, or the colours on the edges of buildings, or it can be wave patterns in the middle of the ocean, or it can be sastrugi, ice ridges. But in the desert, of course, it's effectively sand waves, and they can be shaped over very long periods. I think from a sort of modern, contemporary view, we think of sand as the stuff that comes off beaches and gets in our sandwiches and picnics and stuff, which of course it's doing. But these dunes, some of them have taken 1,000 years to form. They're more like very, very slowly moving mountains. They, some of them were around, for hundreds of years before we were, and will be for hundreds of years after we were. But the simple rule, because there's a whole beautiful, complex art to interpreting sand dunes, but the way to get up and running is a simple, shape in nature, which is the direction the wind has come from will be the shallow angle, and the steep, what's known as the slip face, because you can't walk on it because it's much slipperier than is the direction the wind's gone towards. And once you're accustomed to looking at that, and you've using whatever method you want to, you've worked out what the prevailing wind direction is. Literally every sand dune's a compass, and that's good fun to play with.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. How timely it is that we're talking right before I go on this adventure.
Great.
I know I'm totally selfishly utilizing this podcast to get some insights before I go. Let's talk about some of the other things that we can use in other landscapes, not just desert landscapes. You mentioned the stars, and I think when we think about historical navigation, right, sort of, not necessarily even pre-scientific, because I don't know, we think about those early compasses and early tools that explorers used to use, but navigation across the board, maritime navigation, maybe, we're always thinking about the stars. You look to the stars, and then or maybe the way that the sun rises and the sun sets. But those aren't the only tools that we have at our disposal, are they?
No, I quite often say to people, start at the top and work down. So if you've got the sun or the stars, you want to use them, because I learned the hard, stupid way that if you don't, I could have been looking at some wonderful lichens and using them to find south and ignoring the sun. And then 10 minutes later, it's clouded over for the rest of the day. So you kind of want to have some fun with those whilst they're there. And then you come down and you tune into what the wind's doing, because if you've got a good sense of where the wind's coming from, it's actually quite hard to get totally disorientated. So you can use the wind or the wind or the clouds. The clouds will appear to come from a slightly different direction, because the wind that pushes the clouds, when it touches the Earth's surface, it experiences friction and it backs, so it turns to the left. So we see it come from we sense it come from an anti-clockwise direction. But that's complicating things. Just in a general sense, quite a fun city trick is if you're going to a meeting in a city and you're using the subway or something like that, just tune into which way the clouds are moving. Just note yourself, oh yeah, I can see the clouds going from west to east today. And then you can set yourself a little challenge. If it's not a sort of life critical meeting, if it's not a new job or something like that, you just get off a subway that's maybe a stop or two early, and just say, okay, I know I need to, let's say, walk north for quarter of a mile to get to the place I want to get to. Then you hop out of this subway in a part of town you don't know at all, and you go, okay, I need to go north. I know the clouds going from west to east. Okay, I need to head that way. You just have to be careful not to be staring at the clouds as you cross the road, as I've done a couple of times, because that's lethal. But
I love that. That's so smart. And you mentioned lichen growing on trees as well, if you're ever in the forest.
yes, the breadth and the number of clues. I mean, in one of my books, in The Lost Art of Reading Nature's Signs, there's 850 of these signs, which can sound a little bit daunting, but actually most of them are underpinned by some quite simple rules.
Mm-hmm.
Light and wind being two of the really big ones. So if we take light, the sun is due south in the middle of the day every day of the year for everyone north of the tropics, which is pretty much all of the US and all of Europe. And so that creates asymmetries in everything we see. I've talked about tree shapes, but if we think about it, if there's any relief at all, and the land is never perfectly flat, it's quite hard to make a pool table, and the real world is never that flat.
Yeah.
So any bump, whether it's a small rock or a little patch of dirt or a plant that's only 6 inches high, is creating different niches, different microhabitats. That you get different things happening on one side and the other. So we get lichens need light, so you don't find them deep in caves. And what we find is the amount of light dictates which lichens and even their color. So most of the lichens you see will have a more vibrant color if they're getting direct sunlight. And it takes a bit of practice to be able to use that as a compass quickly. But all I say to people is just, if you happen to notice color on the bark of trees, just start making a mental note. It doesn't have to be precise. Just sort of go, okay, it's roughly lunchtime. I can see the sun, so I know south's roughly that way, and I'm getting all these wonderful colours on the south side. And then if you do that enough times, the sun goes behind some clouds, and you sense, oh, that tree's telling me south's that way. And that's true of pretty much every outdoor patch there is.
Oh, that's so neat. And what about, I have to ask, because you have an entire book dedicated to water. You gave me a little bit of insight about being in the desert, at these oasis areas, that the animals and specifically the insects are going to be more abundant near the water. What other ways can we use water for navigation or just for appreciating nature, for understanding it a little bit better?
Yeah, it's there are lots and lots of different signs, which are all they all fit into this very simple idea, which is if you think of your favorite patch of water, it can be anything from the Pacific Ocean to a tiny stream to a city fountain to a park pond. Any of those, they're water. They count. If you think every single time you look at them, they look slightly different. It's impossible to look at water and see the same thing twice in your life because there's just so much going on.
It's the stuff of many philosophers.
Yeah, yeah. And if we approach it sort of practically, we can say, why is that? And then suddenly we start to realize, okay, there are, as in all these nature things, there are building blocks. So wind is one of them. Wind will create ripples, and then we look across and we say, well, why is there a dark patch there? Oh, that's a gust, and it has a nickname, a cat's paw. I don't know if you come across that name, but sailors get to know cat's paws because there never will be a technology that can predict a gust is about to hit you on water as well as a cat's paw. You just look out there, and the light is reflecting off the normal waves and ripples in a certain way. Then when a gust touches the water, you get a dark patch. Then when waves and ripples hit something, it can be a small stone in a pond, or it can be an island in the middle of the Pacific. It creates certain patterns through, just laws of nature, just basic physics, refraction, diffraction, reflection. Those three things, people start to get, post-traumatic stress disorder flashbacks to physics lessons that went wrong. But probably not on your podcast actually, but on a few of them. But once we recognise those patterns, you see them everywhere. You can even see them in a puddle. You see the same patterns that Pacific Island navigators sensed in their boat. They would close their eyes, lie on the deck of an outrigger canoe, and go, okay, I'm now picking up the reflected rhythm. They've got their eyes shut and they're detecting land that's still a day's sail away and well out of sight.
Wow.
So that's the kind of premise of the water reading. You can go from something really tiny, like noticing the way that there's a meniscus on water in your glass, right up to the Pacific. And the things you notice in the glass and the things you see on the ocean can swap. So the patterns you see in the smallest bit of water are valid in the biggest, and vice versa. So it really doesn't matter the scale of what you're looking at. There are signs and there are patterns that have meaning. And once I kind of think of befriending them. One of my favourites, the glitter path. When the sun is low, it reflects off the water, and it's a classic. You're on the west coast there, so you hopefully get plenty of nice sort of sunsets over the water. And once again, a basic law of nature, that the bigger the wave, the wider the scattering of the light. So this beautiful glitter path is telling you how rough the water is, even if you couldn't sense it in any other way. And those are my favourite signs, the ones that are both practical and beautiful. And knowing the practical and knowing what to look for makes you stop, makes you look, makes you actually enjoy the beautiful more. And that's the sort of stuff that gets me really excitable.
Well, and what I love about this is that water is this naturally occurring resource. It's so important. It's fundamental to life. It's everywhere. Yet we have a strange relationship with water in our modern era because we sterilize it and we have all of these man-made containers for it. And, there are parts of the world that are in massive drought. There are parts in the world that are, have too much water in them right now. A lot of things are in flux, but all of these kind of tools that you're helping equip us with have to do with the physical properties of water itself in any container. Because when I first asked about it, I was worried that you would only be talking about natural bodies of water, you can navigate from but no, like a reservoir in the middle of a city can tell you, or like you said, a puddle in made out of concrete in the middle of a road can tell you almost as many clues as the Pacific Ocean itself.
Yeah, and that's where we build our relationship. So if you're standing over a puddle, doesn't matter if you're in the middle of nowhere or in the middle of a city, and you look down at it, you notice, let's say, the pavement that's underneath it. But if you then start walking away from the puddle, you take a few steps away and you look back, you start to notice that you can just about see the bottom of the puddle, but you're now starting to see trees reflected in the distance. And you realize that there's an angle there where we get total reflection, which is why, and it starts to explain things like the color of the sea. So if you imagine standing on a beach, you stare down, you're ankle deep in the sea, you stare down, you can see your feet. But if you stare out to the sea, the color you see is much more dictated by the sky. And that it's not hugely shocking when I hopefully explain when like that, but when you realize you can teach yourself to sense that, to understand it better by looking at puddles. As I say, the scale, instead of being a barrier, which I once thought it was, I thought, well, these techniques and tricks that I've learned over the years apply in big oceans, and these ones are relevant in ponds, and these ones are for rivers. Once you learn them and once you befriend them, you find that actually it's impossible not to see them. I've yet to come across a situation where there's a patch of water, bigger than a thumbnail, where I can't start to notice some of these, these characters, these signs.
You're doing science experiments in your bathtub all the time, aren't you? I know you are. I know you are. All right, so let's talk for a few minutes about your new book, How to Read Nature: Awaken Your Senses to the Outdoors You've Never Noticed. What is new about this book? You've written on this topic so much in the past, and you've written kind of more specialized books like the book about water. You've written a very good user's guide, The Lost Art of Reading Nature Signs, where you said there was over 800 different signs available to us all the time. So How to Read Nature: Awaken Your Senses to the Outdoors You've Never Noticed. What's new and what's different about this book?
It's aimed at a group of people who maybe have that sort of feeling, because it's a very popular sort of message today that there must be something worthwhile in nature, but they're not convinced it's for them yet. And so I do things like, instead of, most of my books are aimed at the person who's converted and finds the idea of outdoor signs. Yeah, I like that. I want that. I want more. Give me. Those. Whereas this is different. This is like saying, okay, you're prepared to invest a bit of time. You're going to give it the benefit of the doubt. And basically, I'm trying to show you the things that are irresistible about nature. So if we think of, people are aware of the broadest changes in nature, like the seasons, but people are perhaps less well tuned to the very short term changes. So once we start to realize that actually the flowers are responding on a not just hourly but minute by minute basis, they change. Imagine there's a park you go to every day and you just sort of go like, okay, I've grown familiar with those flowers. Perhaps I've even taken the time to work out what they're called. Doesn't matter if you haven't. One of the things I say in the book is do not be put off nature by names, because that's a shame. You don't need any names at all to have a lot of fun with nature. But you just happen to notice, oh yeah, I get half an hour in this park every day, and I notice at the start of it, the flowers are pointing to the left of that tree, and at the end of it, they're pointing at the middle of the tree. And you suddenly have tuned into a clock that's perhaps been by your feet for years. Or there's the lessons that we can take in there's nobody on earth who doesn't have an interest in relationships, but actually, there are an awful lot of people who don't necessarily want to read a book about relationships. There are definitely a lot of people who do want to read a book about relationships, and this is not a book about relationships, but it is it is a fun way of reflecting on how nature deals with all the challenges we have in our lives. So, nature has pretty much every flavor of how, two people, or in the case of nature, two organisms, can get along okay. There are emperor penguins where the dad suffers the winter storms for months on end, which is it's a story I tell to my friends down the pub whilst my wife's back at home looking after the kids. No, it's I'm joking, but what I mean is there's life is full of opportunities, problems, challenges. We can put any label we want on that, and nature has had to solve it, many millions of times over. So sometimes confronting our problems head on is not what we want to do, but actually going out into nature and just sort of going, all right, then give me the answer, and we find it does, which is, I think, good fun.
Well, Tristan, I think that's such a good close to this great conversation that we've been having so far. I have to ask, though, I close every episode by asking my guests the same two questions. And of course, this sort of very specialized conversation that we've had makes me incredibly curious how you're going to answer these two, because they're a bit big picture. Are you ready for them?
I'm nervous.
Oh, don't be. All right, here we go. So there's sort of two sides of the same coin. When you think about the future, and that can be in any context that's relevant to you, it can be the future of, humanity, the future of Mother Nature, the future of Earth, or just the future of you, your family, your individual life. Number one, what is the thing that keeps you up the most at night? What is the thing you're most concerned about, most preoccupied with, honestly, most worried about? And on the flip side of that, what are you most optimistic and hopeful and excited about?
Wow, yeah, you weren't kidding. Big picture. Yeah, no, good questions, and I haven't been asked them before. The thing that keeps me up at night is the tendency of things to compound. So we don't see change as a linear thing. I mean, you can see it manifested in so many different ways. But if I just, is it Moore's law that dictates that chip speeds double every 3 years or so? I forget the detail, but that is not a straight line. That is an exponential change. And then if we think of the networking ability of everything else, there's obviously a huge amount of positive going on. But the thing that slightly makes me mildly anxious, I'm an optimist, so it doesn't keep me awake yet. But there is a slight feeling of anxiety there. Is the rate of change? If we look at what's happened in the last 20 years, we are all very hopeful that change is going to come out on the positive side, because if it doesn't, it's going to happen so fast that we won't see the blur. Is my gut feeling. But I'm an optimist, so I hope the change, the exponentially fast change, is for the better. What was the second question again? I got carried away thinking about that one.
Well, it's sort of the flip side. In a way, you answered it, unless you have another answer, which is what are you most hopeful for, or what are you most excited about?
Oh yeah, I think I have answered it in another sort of angle to it would be that I think there's a good track record of human beings overshooting the mark a bit, but then spotting it and then getting the best of both worlds and everything. So if I think of food, there are lots of parts of the world where people are still struggling to have enough to eat, but in parts of the world, Western parts of the world where we've gone the other way, we've created problems of obesity and stuff like that. We notice it, and it is then possible. It's a challenge, but it is then possible to have a situation where we're not confronted with starvation, and we realise there's more to life than vast numbers of bland calories. So you can have a situation where you're not starving, but you're enjoying cooking something simply. And I've seen that trend in food, as we all have, and I think navigation is now one of those areas. It's a fundamental human skill, and we've assumed it's all about necessity, it's all about efficiency, it's all about speed. But actually, if you use a computer to do all of the getting from A to B, you miss most of what's in between. So we're now at the point where we can have the best of both worlds. If we want to get to point B as fast as possible, the computers will help us do that. If we want to have a more interesting, perhaps slightly slower experience, spot what's in between A and B and think a little bit more about B as well, then we can have that as well. So that's my optimism, the best of both worlds.
Oh, I love it. Well, Tristan, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute blast, and I've learned so much.
Oh, thanks so much for having me on, Cara. I love the theme of your podcast. I didn't know it existed until I came across it, and it's one for me, definitely.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm so glad. And I just know that my listeners are going to eat this stuff up, especially those who are interested in nature, but even those who stay all day inside at their desk or in the lab who want to go outside. I think that this is a great user's guide to get our feet wet and to open up our appreciation. So again, I have to thank you, and I have to urge everybody to check out Tristan's newest book, How to Read Nature, Awaken Your Senses to the Outdoors You've Never Noticed. By the time this episode airs, it will be available on Amazon. But if you are prescient and you somehow can read minds and you go to order it ahead of time, you can pre-order right now. Thanks so much, Tristan, for joining me.
Thanks so much, Cara. Have fun in the Sahara.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I know I will. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.